You tend to get people who are a little bit more, maybe more free thinkers, who just discover your little under the radar podcast. You could call it cycle touring, adventure cycling. Again, it's not sort of racing. It's kind of experience in the countryside, stopping at interesting places, learning something about the place you're in, having a good lunch, nice bit pubs and tea rooms and cafes and things like that. It's kind of narrow lane with an overhanging trees that meet in the middle, shooting through a green tunnel.
I guess in that sense, I descend more like a mountain biker. Welcome to Tell Me About Your Bike, the podcast about the meaning of life, the universe, and bicycling. I'm your host, Wesley Cheney. In this episode, I sit down with Jack Thurston, host of The Bike Show, to talk about riding in town and country. Welcome to Tell Me About Your Bike, Jack.
Thank you, Wesley.
It's a pleasure to have you on here. It's been years that I have listened to you in my earbuds as I've been riding around. So it feels quite normal to have this conversation with you on the other side of the Atlantic and hearing your voice in my earbuds once again.
But this time it's interactive because you can ask me stuff and we can chat. I can. Even better.
You have influenced me in some profound ways. There's been many of your shows. I can remember you used to do some musical special shows, and I ended up tracking down those recordings and listening to them myself. And I can also. The need for the bike, I have read essays from that based off of, you introduced me to that as well. So I wanted to say thank you on that one as well. That was such a great gift in my life.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It's an interesting community of listeners to the Bike Show. And I kind of get to know people in quite random ways because you'll suddenly encounter someone and they'll either recognize my voice or we'll get talking and they'll say, oh, there's this bike, there's this podcast or whatever. And one or two people. It's not hordes of people that I encounter who are listeners, but it's a nice community. I think with anything that's sort of not in the mainstream of media, the stuff that people seek out for themselves, and you tend to get people who are a little bit more, maybe more free thinkers, who discover your little under the radar podcast. That's how it certainly felt starting the podcast when I was doing it. Well, it was originally a radio show, the Bike Show, on a London station, and then
Resonance
a listener
FM.
got in touch, said Resonance FM, London's art radio station.
Yes.
And a listener got in touch and said, can you make your radio program available as a podcast? And this was in 2005.
I was going to say, you were on the very cutting edge of podcasting.
Oh, well, I know. I mean, if only I'd known what podcasting was going to become, right. I could have made a success of my life. But anyway, there we go. I kind of figured out how to do it. And we started putting those episodes up as podcasts in 2005, which, really brought a much wider audience to the Bike Show than there was just on a small FM broadcast in London. And also, it's a weird kind of temporal. People are going through the back catalogue of the Bike Show because there's not too many episodes around at the minute. I've got other things that I'm doing, and so it's just not been possible to get as much output. But people occasionally discover it and then go back through and realise there's 300 episodes of this thing, near enough.
It's a fantastic back catalogue.
And kind of binge listen. I don't know quite what that's like to binge listen to me wittering on about bikes for 300 hours, but there we go.
Oh, no, I've enjoyed it. I've been listening since about, I think, 2005, 2007. I remember having to download the podcast into iTunes on my Macintosh laptop and then manually sync it to my iPod, and then I could listen to it as I was riding around. But it took a much longer time. Whereas nowadays, I can remember sitting back there with my iPod thinking, wouldn't it be neat if my iPod was Wi-Fi enabled and I could actually just listen instantaneously to any podcast and I didn't have to go through it. Gosh, that would be amazing. And now it's here. I can just listen wherever I am, and I think that's really opened up your you as in the podcasting world is that so many people are able to find biking content and discover this gem of a little show, and the discussions that you have on it and the variety of guests, it's always amazing to me. So, but one question I've always had for you is, what was it like when you started strapping a microphone onto your bike, say 15 years ago? How much equipment were you hauling around compared to what you could do today?
I'm pretty much using the same as what I use today for what I call the rolling interviews, which is when I go for a bike ride with somebody and we chat as we go. The first one I did of those was a ride across London from Chiswick, which is in West London, out on the River Thames, through the Royal Parks and into kind of the West End, really, with a guy who was an editor of some music magazines, and kind of an interesting figure in the world of music journalism. And I just carried a handheld reporter's mic plugged into a digital recorder, and I think I might have had a basket or some kind of bag on the front of my bike. I'm a big fan of handlebar bags, for having quick access to stuff. So I probably had it in my handlebar bag, and then I just held the microphone in my hand, and I bought this microphone called an Electro Voice RE50, which is a kind of absolute standard issue, particularly for American news reporters, NPR type of people, and they're pretty much indestructible, and they're also very good at defeating wind noise. And so I think if it hadn't been for those things, the fact that I've got a pretty indestructible mic that's also able to reject the sound of the wind that you get on a bicycle, if I hadn't just had that good fortune to be using a mic that worked for that application, I might not have pursued the format. But I basically used that same mic. Or it's not actually the same mic, because the original mic I had fell out of a saddlebag on an overnight bike ride.
Oh no!
I did. There's this big overnight bike ride to the coast that happens every summer from London.
Right.
I think I was getting the Dunwich Dynamo. That's it. Yeah. And I was getting tired, and I think I was doing these stopping and doing a bit of recording, and then getting back on the bike. And I think I just stuffed it carelessly into the saddlebag, and it must have just popped out, because when I arrived at the beach, it wasn't there.
No. Oh, that would, yeah. And so now you're not recording anything more after that point.
So that was it. That was the end of the show. Yeah, somewhere in the Suffolk countryside, in some hedge on the edge of a lane, there's a really nice Electro Voice RE50 microphone that somebody, well, I hope somebody found it and was able to make use of it, you know.
Well, it was indestructible enough. It should be okay. Might be a little dented, but not too bad.
Yeah, we'll see what the archaeologists make of it.
Well, what I've been doing on my bike has been, I have my iPhone, and I've found that I've got this this oversized protective case on it that I now have so it shields the microphone when my iPhone is mounted up on my handlebar. It shields it from the wind. So I'm able to record myself fairly well, and then if I'm riding right next to somebody, I can pivot the phone in its mount towards them, and so do it as sort of a directional thing. It's not great, it's not fantastic audio, but it's guerrilla audio. I mean, it gets the story told, and so I use that to record. I did a century out in Western Virginia, in the mountains, and there was, I think, something like 15,000 feet of climbing in 108 miles. So I recorded all of that with my phone on the front of my handlebars, and I recently released an episode called 108 Miles in 63 Minutes. And it was just the whole day of riding compressed into one 63-minute podcast, which is. Yeah, it was the first time I'd ever tried to edit something like that together. But you were the inspiration for me to do that. And I don't know if you remember, but more than a decade ago, I emailed you and asked you about what microphones you were using, because I was strapping microphones onto my bike, and you had responded to my email and actually gave me some advice on that and mentioned your mics then. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, holding it in one hand, and that means you've got to cycle it with one hand,
Right.
which, is an acquired skill, and it means you can't necessarily do it in every type of cycling environment. And I've, ended up nearly going into a canal or various mishaps. So yeah, actually I did it. The last bike ride I did, which was on Friday night. I went. So that's the day before yesterday. I cycled. I had some spare data on my monthly data allowance on my phone.
Uh-huh.
So I did an Instagram live bike ride, basically. So just
neat.
strapped the phone on the front of my bike, and I could choose whether to have it facing forward or facing
Right.
backwards to me, and then just chatted away to about half a dozen people.
I will have to go watch that. I didn't.
I wouldn't recommend it. The wind sound was terrible, but I was just kind of intrigued. I'm kind of intrigued by live video because it does seem to be something that people like,
Yeah.
and I quite like looking at things. I quite like Instagram Live. I did an Instagram Live book launch for my latest cycling guidebook because during the coronavirus thing, I was, you can't do a real book launch,
Right?
Because the book came out right in the middle of our lockdown. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to. We've got quite a big garden here where I live in Wales, so I found a place where I sometimes have a little campfire with the kids, and strung up a hammock and got a little my battery-powered record player out and a few copies of the book, and I just kind of lit the campfire and just set up the Instagram Live and just chatted away about the book. And I don't know, I mean, I think there were maybe 100 people or 150 people dropped in at any one time, which is more than you get at a book launch. So, it was fun to do. I mean, I think in this lockdown, we've all been, I know you've been out because you're working through it, but key workers and all that. But a lot of us have been just kind of stuck at home, kind of thinking of things to do to make one day different from the next.
Oh, I'm with you on
and having
that
having a little party in the garden on Instagram Live was a way of doing that.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic way to do that. I wasn't following you on Instagram, so I'll have to make sure that I am after we get done with this conversation and check some of those out. That would be a treat. So tell me more about your new book. What's the title of it again?
So the new book is called Lost Lanes North, and it's the fourth in this series of guidebooks to different regions of the United Kingdom. Basically, great bike rides, where to go, reflecting my kind of interest in you could call it cycle touring, adventure cycling. Again, it's not sort of racing. It's kind of experience in the countryside, stopping at interesting places, learning something about the place you're in, having a good lunch, nice bit pubs and tea rooms and cafes and things like that. So yeah, it's a collection of routes that people can ride with photographs, maps, and then all the digital files and all that. So it's a guidebook, really. I mean, they've been around for years.
Right.
I mean, cycling guidebooks. So it's just my contribution to the medium.
And is it available as an ebook?
It's available as an ebook. Yeah, I mean, it's not much used to anyone who's outside the UK.
Right.
But it is available as an ebook.
Well, I may at least check out the sample of it just to see on my iPad, because it's escapism right now in the quarantine to be thinking about riding around the UK. So
yeah, definitely check out the sample.
Yeah.
There's a Kindle edition.
All right. Well, I will be looking at that. So you're in the countryside of what part of Wales again?
Southeast Wales, Monmouthshire is our county, just outside Abergavenny.
Okay. I have some Welsh ancestry, small amount, that migrated over to the first to Prince Edward Island and then eventually to Boston in the early part of the 19th
do you know where they were
century.
from?
I think they were from Cardiff.
Which part of Wales?
I'm not entirely certain. I don't know too much about them, but it's always been my small Welsh connection. I have one great grandmother who came from there. So, but you were originally in London with Resonance FM. That's when you started the podcast. When did you make the transition from London to Wales?
So my wife and I moved down in 2013, the beginning of 2013. She had a connection with the town. Her grandparents lived here, and all her family beyond her grandparents were from here, and her parents came back regularly to here, and she's always loved the area. And she's a gardener and a kind of garden designer, landscape designer, and we had this opportunity to look after a place where her grandmother used to garden, who she's passed on since. So basically, she's kind of taken on the baton of this garden that her grandmother helped to make. And we were just looking for I was ready for a change. We were expecting a baby. She was expecting a baby. We were expecting a baby jointly. She had the baby. Right. It's always quite funny getting those sentences right when you're the man.
I never said we are pregnant.
Exactly.
Even though I'm a father of two, I never said we are pregnant.
You don't want to be that guy.
I was there.
You don't want to be that guy. Yeah. I was there. Exactly. Yeah, I held the towel. I thought we lived in a small flat in central London, and it just seemed like the right time. There's loads of good cycling around here. I was coming to the end of the work that I was doing in London, so I didn't have a kind of particular reason to stay professionally. And a change is as good as a rest. I mean, I always look back to the time I spent in your country. I spent 2 years in Berkeley, California, in the late 90s, as some amazing time in a different place, basically, from where I've always lived. So I think it's good to change up your location now and then. And moving to Wales it felt for me, because there's a different language here, even though it's not spoken widely in the part of Wales that I live in. Still, all the town names, a lot of the town names are Welsh, and a lot of names of forests and rivers and things like that. Landscape features are in Welsh language, and it just seemed kind of exotic and exciting to come to a new country with a different language and different culture and a different history, rather than going to kind of some provincial part of England.
Right.
But
So the biking has been I guess very different from riding in London than what you're experiencing now in Wales is quite different from riding in London.
Totally. It's totally rural,
Tell me about your last ride. Where were you riding to?
So I just went for this was my little Instagram live ride, where I just rode up our big hill, which is called the Blorange Mountain. And it's not a mount, it's like 500 meters.
Right.
So in height, or maybe 600. What's that in?
It's around 1,800 or
feet.
2,000 feet.
So it's like a big hill rather than a mountain. But it's a good climb, and there are lots of different ways up it. So I went up it one way, one of my favourite ways, along an old railway line that's been converted, a kind of rails to trails project has been converted into a traffic-free biking and walking trail.
Cool.
And then a little bit of the old canal that goes around the mountain, because it's an sort of industrial area from the sort of
from the coal mining
heyday
days
of the Industrial Revolution, coal mining, iron making up on the hill, and lime quarries and that kind of thing. And then there's a great road that just winds its way up around the side of a hill, and then you suddenly come out into the open country, and there's like sheep grazing on the open land, and then you're at the top, and there's a couple of radio masts, and it's you could half close your eyes and convince yourself you'd just ridden up Mont Ventoux with the radio masts there on this lonely road, and then it's a fun descent just to come back down the other side, very steep through some beech woods. So you've got those kind of narrow lane with an overhanging trees, trees that meet in the middle, it's got that sort of tunnel, of that green tunnel, shooting through a green tunnel.
Oh, that's beautiful.
On the way back down.
Oh, that's fantastic. I can totally see doing that. Descending is one of my favorite things to do on a bike. I grew up in Vermont, and there was around my house as a teenager, I started exploring more and more on my bike and getting out of town. And we lived in a very small town. And in some ways, it was actually a lot like Wales, because the town was littered with these big industrial buildings where the factories had closed. So we lived in an old factory town on the banks of this river. From what I've seen on the BBC, Wales looks a lot like Vermont does. And so I was going out and exploring these steep roads on my bike, and then started getting more and more into going faster and faster down the hills. And so I would gladly plod up these hills just so I could blast back down. And I knew once I got a bike computer and I could find out how fast I was going, it terrified my mother. I would tell her, come home and be like, I beat my top speed. I was doing 43 down the hill today. And she'd just be like, she doesn't want to hear this. She would say, I already have one son in a wheelchair. I don't need two.
Oh. Yeah, well, that's a kind of interesting point there, a distinction between the psychology of hills from a perspective of a road cyclist and a mountain biker.
Right.
Because a mountain bikers, when they cycle up the hills together, they just chill out. They kind of like, ride a really low gear, and they just chat and pass the time of day, and then get to the top of the hill and they're gone. They they just zoom off. Whereas for road cyclists, it's all about kind of getting a great time or putting your maximum effort on climbing the hill. And then, on the on the way back down, you just kind of
you're
coast
chilling out.
Down.
Yeah, you're not trying to go as fast as you can. Yeah, it is very different. I guess in that sense, I descend more like a mountain biker, and I really love riding it. I mean, I've done some epic descents on my mountain bike and on my road bike. I spent some time up in Alaska, working for 2 seasons as a bicycle tour guide up in Alaska, and got to ride in some mountain valleys out there and over some mountains as well on my mountain bike, and just some totally gorgeous parts of the Yukon with phenomenal mountain biking on Montana Mountain in Carcross, Yukon. So I have some fond memories of that, but descending when I was a kid was always just this total release, and I just loved it, going down as fast as I could. I think at one point I knew of like 4 or 5 hills within 15 miles of my house where I could break 50 miles an hour on the descent.
Wow.
And I would go out there with my bike computer just to see like how fast can I go today on this? Can I go just a little bit faster? Can I squeak it out? So it's been a lifelong passion for me, which makes it ironic that I'm live right now on a swampy flatlands, and there's the biggest hills we have are bridges that are going over the rivers. So it's changed a little bit, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. Well, I look forward to hearing the next episode of the bike show. When do you think it might be coming out, Jack?
So yeah, I was gonna do a feature looking at trying to introduce people to the idea of going for like a longer journey on a bicycle. Maybe instead of the holiday that they'd got planned, because I think a lot of things, with the COVID situation, cycle touring and camping is a pretty COVID-friendly holiday. Yeah. I mean, in lots of different ways, in terms of, exposure to the virus, potentially, it's quite low. You're outside the whole time. You're kind of pretty self-contained. It's also very cheap.
Right.
And people are, feeling the pinch financially at the minute. A lot of people are. And I think a lot of places are like hotels and holiday accommodations and things like that. Restaurants and cafes are kind of shut, or it's difficult to get into them or whatever, and people aren't traveling overseas on holidays. So I just want to tempt people into the idea of saddling up and getting their panniers and going for a sort of a week long or a 4 or 5 day long bicycle trip.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to a guy who's very knowledgeable but on some of these long distance itineraries around the UK. I mean, and I realise they're not long distance in the way that you've got in the United States,
right.
Trans-American trails and things like that. So yeah, it's not like that sort of long distance, but enough to get a sense of having gone from one coast to the other coast or whatever of Great Britain. And so yeah, we're going to talk about that. I don't know. It's difficult to do stuff that isn't remote at the minute.
Yes.
In terms of interviewing and things like that. But there's a lot of... We do seem to be going through some kind of bicycle boom. I don't know if that's the same where you are.
It is. Bike stores are sold out on bikes, and they're back ordered for months. So it's been, and we're seeing a lot more people who are out on their bikes because it's just one of the ways that they can explore the city right now. And that doesn't. And the other thing that also happened at the same time. For us, the scooters went off the street. The for hire scooters were removed at the beginning of quarantine. So people who had gotten used to riding around on the scooters, they'd been in our city for 2 years, suddenly found themselves without them. And so bikes were the way to go. Well, they last week they just brought the scooters back as we're starting to reopen, which looks like it's going to be a premature reopening. We're seeing a spike in our COVID cases right now. So so we're well aware. We're watching as numbers are starting to go up, and there's been some graphs that have shown that. In states and counties that voted for Hillary Clinton, COVID cases have been going down. In states and counties that voted for Donald Trump, COVID cases have been going up.
Oh God!
So it's
I mean, well, he's not been setting a great example in terms of the way he's been talking about the disease. So if you're the kind of person that takes your cues from Donald Trump, then I can understand why you maybe not been taking the right sort of precautions.
Yeah,
I don't know.
No, and there's libertarians who own small businesses who are just like my local garage where I get my car serviced. The owner has apparently decided that he's not enforcing the state mandate to wear masks inside in public spaces.
Right. Oh yeah. Oh, God.
So he's got a whole team of 15 people working in the garage. And not one of them is wearing a mask. And I walked in and I had a mask on, and I'm looking around and I'm feeling like I want to say something, but I'm not in that place. I'm not saying anything. But it's really common. It's become this thing. If Trump has politicized masks to the point where he says people are wearing masks to show they don't like me.
Oh my God! I mean, it's so strange because wearing a mask is not even. I mean, I know they say, oh yeah, it's not. It's like sissy to wear a mask, when it's actually the reverse. It's because wearing a mask is not it's not helping you to avoid the disease. It's helping others to avoid the disease should you have it and not know it.
Right.
So ultimately, it's actually what it is. And I don't mean this in a kind of gendered way, but it's chivalrous. It's kindness to others and thoughtfulness to others. And I guess maybe that's not big in Trump world, but it could have been spun as being like, I am looking after, my fellow man.
Yes.
But I don't know. Which is kind of even in conservative circles, that is still a virtue. You'd have thought.
You would have thought. But the poll numbers are showing that Trump is slipping. He's got a 14-point gap to Joe Biden in some areas. So there's some hope on the horizon. There's not a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I follow it all quite closely
Yeah.
because, as I said, I lived for a couple of years in the States, and I've got a lot of American friends, and I listen to like a few American politics podcasts, and I'm like, oh God, but it's so long until the actual vote.
Yeah.
You know, and you just have this awful feeling that something bad's going to happen.
And this would not be the first summer when the challenger was leading in the polls, and we thought that he was going to be winning, and then it reverses and something stupid happens. John Kerry, I think, at one point was leading George Bush during the summer, and we thought, oh, we've got this, and no, we didn't. But that's okay. I mean, but speaking of political podcasts, have you ever heard of Thomas Jefferson Hour?
I have not. No, is that a good one?
It is a beautiful one. It was also one of the earliest of podcasts, and it was one that I would download to my iPod back in the day. But it's comes out of North Dakota, and Clay Jenkinson is a humanist philosopher, you could call him, kind of this Midwest Plains sage, and he personifies Thomas Jefferson. So he'll answer questions from listeners about, sometimes they'll ask him about, tell me about your copying machine, or when did you first try to introduce olives to the Americas, or they'll have questions for him about the Declaration of Independence, but oftentimes the questions will come into contemporary politics. And so Thomas Jefferson will always say, well, the earth belongs to the living, so it's not up to me to say whether or not you should have had a new constitution by now, but 200 years, you might have thought about it. I advocated once every 20 years you should have a new constitution. So it's an interesting show. It's definitely worth checking out, Thomas Jefferson Hour, and it's a free public radio show, so they don't charge public radio stations to air it, and so there's a nationwide public radio stations play the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and then Clay Jenkinson will come particularly here to Norfolk, Virginia, and will do presentations where he'll be in person in tights with a wig on. Answering questions as Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, so it's a very reasoned, humanist, enlightened podcast, and he's always calling for civility and to return to the Jeffersonian ideals of America. It might be worth checking out for you, the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Yeah, I'm thinking who would be the bicycle equivalents of Thomas Jefferson, for some historical figure that you could run a bicycle-related podcast in that same format. I'm thinking of a couple. The French guy Velocio, who is Paul Fournel, is kind of a fan of.
Right.
He had lots of interesting things to say. Maybe not as many interesting things to say as Thomas Jefferson. There was a guy called Kooklos, or William Fitzwater Ray, a British guy he was a pacifist and involved in the Clarion cycling clubs of the sort of turn of the century, which were socialist cycling clubs. There was a big overlap between kind of socialism and the outdoors at that time, and it was all tied up with access to land, and the battle between kind of working people and the landowners and the gentry and all that kind of stuff. So footpath, rights and that sort of stuff.
Very cool.
But yeah, he wrote like the 39 articles of cycling, which are quite funny.
Have you shared
some
any
of them
of those
are
on
a
your
bit
show
some of
before?
them are a bit dated. I haven't. We should do a show. We've done a show on looking at Kooklos. I'm not sure if we went through all the 39 articles.
No, but I seem to recall hearing one or two of them being read.
Yeah, I think definitely some of them were good. Some of them were definitely past their sell-by date for various different reasons. I mean, it is interesting how prevailing attitudes change and how stuff can suddenly look really dated and really like unacceptable.
Right.
And you discover some of that when if you've got children and you're reading your own kids' books that you had when you were a child back to them, and you just look at this thing, and there's a lot. I mean, particularly at this moment in time with all the stuff to do with Black Lives Matter and kind of decolonialization and institutional racism and things like that. There's quite a lot in classic children's literature that probably ought to be just, filed away.
Yeah, there's some
sections
of Mary Poppins which we've been reading in our household that we ended up skipping over and not reading because it was it was just a little too racist, and we were like, no, that's
I can't go there. I had that with Tintin. Yeah, but also one thing I've I don't know what vintage children's books you're reading to your kids, but my ones were from the 1970s, really, when I was a 6-7-year-old, and I'm struck by the level of environmental consciousness in children's books of that era, and how that doesn't really exist today. And I feel like today's children's books seem to have this kind of environmental nostalgia, or sort of a kind of fantasy land of wonderful pristine environments, or enchanted places, but they don't talk about like the threats of pollution and acid rain and all that kind of stuff
in the same way they did during the 70s.
In the same way they did in the 70s. And it's really interesting because you often wonder, are we further ahead than we were then,
right,
or have we actually gone backwards, even though in some ways we have gone, clearly there has been progress in lots of different ways, but we're emitting a lot more carbon dioxide than we were back then.
Right.
It's kind of, and why are we not, why are we not telling these stories to our children? They do seem to pick up a bit on climate change and pollution and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't seem to come through in the stories, in the kids' stories so much.
Huh. That's interesting. I wonder if that tells us something about the outlook of the authors, or is it more of a question of the marketplace?
Yeah, I think it must be both. The publishers, I suppose, not wanting to say things that are too depressing, maybe, about species loss and habitat loss and all that stuff. I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic, and I'm sure there are environmentally conscious children's books being published today, but I just haven't really come across them.
Right.
I mean, there are plenty that be kind to animals and all that. That's a favourite.
Right.
That's never has always been around. But in terms of seeing factories belching out black smoke and poisoning the rivers, I mean, I've got 3 or 4 books from that time that are very literal in that respect.
I think I have some books of the same vintage from the early 70s where it just shows these cars just casually belching out black clouds of smoke, and the brown rivers with dead fish floating in them. It was just a children's book illustration. It was just that was considered normal, and the amount of garbage on the street. And that would
be considered extreme now, probably.
Yes.
I love the 1970s, and I love particularly. I mean, one feature I'd love to do, and if you've got listeners to your podcast who have first-hand recollections of that bike centennial.
Oh, right.
The great transcontinental bike rally, jamboree, whatever it was. I would love to talk to them and find out what it was like, because I think I look back at the photographs from that time, and they are not photographs that I consider to be history, because I was just alive. Right. I mean, I was a kid when I was like 3 or 4 years old, so I don't consider them as like historical photographs, but clearly they are historical photographs. They're 40 years old now, or more, and they're wonderful photographs of just great looking people on a brilliant adventure across America. It just looks such a great time, and there was so much community action and kind of mutual support in the 70s, and I think a lot of that just got blown apart by the kind of Reagan Thatcher revolutions of the 80s that just, I don't know, swept that lot of that stuff away.
Well, Bike Centennial stayed around, and they became in the past decade they changed their name to Adventure Biking. But they've continued to be a big advocates for bike touring in the U.S. And I'd say in the bike circles that I've wandered in, I actually met a lady who had been on the first Bike Centennial. I met her in Alaska. So I have no clue where she is now. Otherwise, I'd give you a lead. But adventure biking is a big part of the American bike touring scene, and
good for them.
The magazine is still. I actually grew up reading the Bike Centennial magazine in the '80s, and have fond memories of it. And it inspired me to go on my first big bike tour where I was solo, which was when I was 19, and I rode from London to Rome on a mountain bike that I had.
Wow.
I was running slick tires on it, but I had front and rear panniers on it, and a tent and a sleeping bag, and that was my first big bike tour. Got to go over the Alps on that, which was
lovely. Yeah.
And rode Alpe d'Huez on that mountain bike. I took the panniers off, and I left them in a campground at the bottom of the mountain, and then rode up to the top. And it was in it would have been in early April, I think, when I did that. It was before Easter.
There would have been snow.
There was snow up at the top, so when I got up to the top, there was those people who were still skiing, and I was up there in my spandex, taking a picture in the snowbank, and then came back down. It was a beautiful time. Well, Jack,
I'm hoping to go for a big tour in this summer with the kids, but I don't know if we're gonna.
Well, I wanted to ask about
we'll figure it out.
Yeah, how are you introducing biking to your kids, and have you started bike touring with them?
Well, I mean, we use a long tail, and in fact, it's an American bike, extra cycle.
Oh yeah.
Long tail cargo bike with electric assist to do all the school runs and kind of local transport.
Right.
And that's brilliant. We've done 5,000 miles on that in about 4 years, so that's all great. We're just trying to work out. And there's another family who in our town who've got a similar kind of one. They've got the Turn GSD, which is just basically the same sort of thing, really. And they've got their kids are basically the same age as ours. My 7 and 4. Or their son is a bit younger, so 7 and 3, I think they are. Mm-hmm. And we're just trying to work out if we can do a cycle touring, camping trip with the children, around Wales, ideally, with it kind of get the train home or something. And it's just a little bit. You just wonder what you can expect of the children,
right? In
terms of how far they can ride, and then when they've had enough riding. You put them on the back of the e-bike, and then pull the bikes along the back, which is all doable. And we just been out today, just with the e-bikes, with the e-bike and their bikes, fly out to go fly a kite down on the meadow by the river, and help them back up the hill because it was absolutely pouring down with rain suddenly. And we had strong winds and then heavy rain. So I kind of thought, okay, let's whisk them home. So we all got aboard the e-bike and towed their bikes along the back. But I don't know how far we could go, 20 miles, 25 miles. Is that reasonable? I mean, unfortunately, in Britain, we lack, really amazing bike paths that are traffic free. So you kind of have to take account of the how much motor traffic there is on the roads, and whether they're safe riding. I mean, my daughter's got a single speed, she's got with 14-inch wheels, so she's not going to be cycling up too many massive Welsh hills. Right. But we've got this towy rope. I don't know if you've come across those.
No.
It's a kind of elastic. It's a bit like a car towing rope with an elastic core that gives them more of a tow, but without yanking them, because it's got a bit of elastic give in it. So we thought maybe we could employ that. Just trying to kind of get our heads around how to organise a journey like that. I mean, it's nothing major, but it does once the children are involved, it does suddenly feel like you've got to plan it a bit more than just going off on your own.
Yeah, you can't wing it and just be like, oh well, I'll stop and buy something along the way. Yeah, it gets a lot more difficult.
Have you done much? How old are your
My
kids?
kids are 9 and 14, and so
okay, so they're capable cyclotourists.
They're capable of cyclotouring. I don't think that they have the interest right now. They enjoy camping out of the back of the car. They enjoy that, but the longest ride that I've done with my son was about 10 miles. So we live in the city. So he's on his bike with his friends all day long, and where we live is actually a very bike-friendly neighborhood. So he's able to get out on his bike and ride with his friends to the park, ride to school, ride to the library. So although the library's not open right now because of the quarantine.
So how old is he? He's 14.
He's 9.
Did you say?
He's 9.
He's 9. Okay, he's 9.
Yeah,
and your daughter,
my daughter's
14, is she cycling?
She rides a bike as well. She'll ride it to piano lessons, and she'll probably be walking to school for high school when she starts in the fall, assuming that we go back to school. We don't know yet. We're still waiting to figure that out. But they both ride, and they grew up riding on the back of a tandem, and in bike trailers. So when my daughter was 5 months old, we were putting her into the back of the bike trailer, and we're off, and she grew up on it. So,
I mean, I'm aware of the risk of kind of putting them off my own passion, and so I'm conscious of not wanting to do that by oh god, all our holidays are on bikes, just because dad likes bikes, and so I'm kind of aware of not wanting to make that mistake.
My daughter doesn't share my passion. She enjoys getting on a bike just to ride around the neighborhood with her friends, or to ride to go somewhere. She enjoys doing that, but she has said that it's been interesting for her to watch as her younger brother grew up with me, and he's become he's starting to show a real interest in mountain biking, and so we have a couple of small parks in our local area that we can go mountain biking at, and they're not anything spectacular. I mean, it's nothing compared to what we would find in the Blue Ridge of Western Virginia, but it's still off-road, and it still requires some degree of technical prowess to get over these, particularly these muddy and rooty sections that you find in the swamps around here, because that's mostly where we're riding is in the swamp, right next to the these tidal creeks and such, on the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay.
Oh,
yeah, it is lovely. It's got its own character. And you would think the land would be flat, but it's not, because it's always going up and down a little bit on these little muddy rises. But he's become interested in riding his mountain bike with me, and has been slowly getting out there and learning and falling and picking himself up, and then nailing a technical feature, and that'll be for him, like going over a small ramp, but he'll just be stoked that he's done that, and because the last time he tried to get at it, he'd fallen over or something like that. So it's been interesting to watch as he's developed an appreciation for mountain biking, as little as what we can find around here. But I've taken him out and shown him some bigger trails, and he's gotten more interested in it. So we're at the point right now where he's outgrowing one bike, and we need to start looking at buying him his next bike. But right now there's no bikes on the market. So
of course, yeah.
So it's not a good time to go out and try and buy a new mountain bike. We might be able to find something used, but it's
And are you able to cycle out? Are they able to cycle out into the countryside from the city? Is that possible?
No, unfortunately, the suburbs have straggled and have just grown, and so it's really. I've done it myself, and if I go from the city to where it's actually country, it's about 40 miles.
Right. Wow.
From the city center where we live to where it's genuinely rural, is about 40
Yeah.
miles, and and the for bike touring, I've done it a couple of times, riding in and out of the city, and it's 50 miles, 60 miles of constantly looking over your shoulder and worried about the next truck that's going to come barreling down the road at 50 miles an hour, and there often isn't a very good shoulder. The road isn't very wide, and you get these suburban drivers who are, aggravated and don't really want to be sharing the road with a bike. And so it's just not a very pleasant place to ride. I mean, it's for somebody who's got experience like you or me, it's feasible, but
not nice.
It's not nice. It's not relaxing. You're not.
Yeah, and can they hop on a train, like a suburban train, to get out to hop over that bit?
Not really, not very easily. There's train services just starting to come back to Norfolk. It's only been in the past 4 years that we've had a train connection, and the train only runs a couple of days, and you can only take a folding bike on it right now.
Okay, so that's pretty restrictive.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems such a shame as cities developed that they didn't. And a lot of cities kind of introduced green belts as a sort of constraint on the expansion of the city, but they didn't think of introducing like spokes, green spokes to the wheel, like that you can kind of get, to use to either to get into the center or out of the center into the hinterlands. Then it would have been they wouldn't have needed to be a huge amount of land given over. But it's the same all over Britain as well, that you've got city centres that are becoming more and more livable and more cyclable. And you've got the countryside, which is, still basically quite nice and rural, and you can ride a bike there. But it's this suburban donut that you can't penetrate.
Yeah. That's a good term for it. The suburban donut. That's right. And I'll drive.
They have to eat too many donuts in the suburbs as well, don't they?
They do. No, I like it though. It's a good phrase. Well, Jack, we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to have to wrap up. But thank you so much for coming out. And what do you want to plug? Is there where can people listen to the Bike Show? Where can they find your latest book?
Yeah, well, they can listen to The Bike Show wherever you get a podcast. There's lots of back catalogue and hopefully a few more shows coming out this year. And then, my books are called Lost Lanes. If you've got friends in the UK, who might be interested in going cycling in the countryside, I'm sure they'll enjoy them. And there are free previews. There's a website called lostlanes.co.uk where there are previews of the books online if you want to take a look.
All right. Well, we'll check that out.
Thanks for having me, Wesley.
Yeah, cheers so much. Thank you so much, Jack.
All right.
Heat rash. It's hot. It's so hot that I'm not riding to work anymore. The heat index is above 110 degrees. After just an hour outside, my legs are covered in an unfortunate and persistent heat rash. If I rode my bike to work every day, I'd look like a well-cooked lobster from head to toe. So I'm skipping my normal 6-mile ride to the Elizabeth River Ferry and instead driving in. I don't mind the sweating. It's the days of steroids and antihistamines that it takes to get my skin to calm down that I do mind. As long as I can keep moving in the heat, I feel okay. It's when I come to a full stop and put my foot down that the heat reflecting off the asphalt really gets to me, searing me, causing me to question my dedication to bicycling. I fill my water bottle with crushed ice before I ride, but it soon turns to lukewarm water. My clothes are soaked with sweat. The sweat drips down my forehead and onto my glasses. The occasional shade of a tree along my commute is a blessed relief. But as long as I keep moving forward, I get the slightest of breezes and the heat isn't totally encompassing. Work isn't so bad with the heat. My rides rarely last longer than 10 minutes. I get to dodge in and out of air-conditioned offices as I make my lunchtime deliveries. I'm inside just long enough to answer the question, is it hot enough for you? Through it all, I'm still happy to be on my bike. If it wasn't for the heat rash, I'd ride more. Because after all, it's better than sitting in my car, stuck in traffic and waiting for the radiator to overheat. In each episode, I'd like to tell you about a podcast that I listen to on my bike. This week, I want to tell you about Reveal, a podcast created by the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. The current series on Revealed is entitled American Rehab, and it's a 6-episode deep dive into drug rehabs that send people to work and keep all their pay. It's well worth a listen. You can find a link to Reveal in the show notes. So thanks for listening to another episode of Tell Me About Your Bike. You can find us on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and plenty more. In the next episode of Tell Me About Your Bike, Darren Alf, the bicycle touring pro, will be returning to talk about the joys of bikepacking with strangers. Please rate and review Tell Me About Your Bike on your preferred podcasting platform so that more people can hear the good news of bicycling. Car Camper says on Apple Podcasts, just what I'm looking for. Short and sweet, yet I feel like 2 hours of content has just gone by. Found out about this podcast from listening to the Bike Karma podcast. I've listened to some other podcasts that seem cool, but they don't edit, so it's literally 2 hours long. Sometimes it gets boring, but not this one. Love it. Well, thanks for your kind words, Car Camper. One of the things that keeps my episodes brief is that I have a 64-minute time limit in GarageBand. It's a creative constraint that I embrace. If there's another crazy cyclist in your life that would love to hear Tell Me About Your Bike, please share the podcast with them. If this podcast brings value to your life, then please consider supporting Tell Me About Your Bike on Patreon. You can find the Patreon link in the show notes. I'll send an exclusive Tell Me About Your Bike sticker to all my patrons. If you've got a story to tell about the meaning of life, the universe, and bicycling, drop me a line at tellmeaboutyourbike@gmail.com. Let's record a podcast and make some memories. So keep the rubber side down and keep on rolling. Cheers, y'all. This podcast, copyright Rambling Ukulele Productions 2020, all rights reserved.